Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to this session 8 of the Research Methodology Workshop. Today's speaker is Professor Priyamvada. She's going to take us through RCT parallel arm trials. And there's also a session on sample size calculation by Professor Harish Chandra Kumar. So without wasting any time, I request Priyamvada to please go ahead and make a presentation.
Thank you, sir. So today I will be discussing on how to go ahead with the parallel arm randomized trial. So I hope most of you might have gone through the clinical scenario which has already been circulated. So I'll be discussing on how to go about. So what sort of patient population should be included, what should be the objectives, and how to go about and how to analyze the data in different ways. And towards the end of the, once I finish, Dr. Harichandra Kumar will be speaking on how to do the sample size calculation based on this data with the different study designs. So this is the background of the study. There is a drug XYZ which has vascular stabilization properties, and this has been licensed for human use based on a phase 3 trial. The original study which led to the approval recruited patients with myocardial infarction, and in the original study, those with estimated GFR up to 60 ml were recruited. And around 10% of the recruitees had proteinuria with a mean eGFR of around 69 ml. And a post-hoc analysis has shown that this drug has a tendency to preserve glomerular filtration rates in patients with proteinuria. So this is the background. So now what we are trying to do, we are going to design a study to see whether this drug has nephroprotective actions in patients with proteinuric kidney disease. So while writing a proposal for a randomized control trial, these are the things we should have a plan of everything. So first we need to define who should be enrolled, what should be the intervention, what should the controls receive, and we have to define the outcomes. We have to do sample size calculations. Then we should have an idea regarding randomization, blinding, allocation, then when and how data should be collected, and we should have a plan for analyzing the data. So this question was circulated some time back, and I got a couple of responses also. So these were the responses I got. What should be the inclusion criteria? So age between 18 to 60. Then glomerular filtration rate, a few people wanted glomerular filtration rate more than 60 ml to be included, while some other persons wanted those with 15 to 60, and there were a few responses telling that the entire spectrum of the chronic kidney disease can be enrolled. And proteinuria more than 300 to 3000 milligram per day, and people who are on standard of care therapy should be enrolled. Now, while selecting a patient population for a randomized trial, we should select people in such a way that it is relevant to a wide range of patients who might be benefited in the future with the study intervention. And again, it should be practical and clinically relevant, and the inclusion criteria should not be too lax so that we might end up patients who are unlikely to get a benefit. And on the other hand, we should not exclude patients who are likely to get a benefit also. I'm just switching off my video. Probably some bandwidth issues might be there.
Ma'am, I'll do it. You please continue.
Oh, okay, okay. So can you switch off my video?
Yeah, ma'am, done. Please continue.
Okay. So now let us see what level of estimated GFR, patients with what level of estimated GFR should be taken for this study. Now, if we include the entire spectrum of CKD, say eGFR with starting from more than 15 to CKD stage 4 to CKD stage 1, the problem is it is too broad. And again, we know the progression rates are going to be heterogeneous. Sometimes the event rates might be very minimal. Say it might be around 10 to 15%. if we follow them up for a period of say 2 or 3 years or sometimes more. And another problem here in the given situation is the study which led to the approval of the drug has recruited only patients with EGFR more than 60 ml. So we don't know whether the investigators had set such a criteria because they wanted to avoid chronic kidney disease, because those with GFR 60 ml probably the drug effects might be different, or we are not sure whether it was because of some safety concerns regarding the drug. Suppose if the original study set an inclusion criteria of 60 ml based on lack of safety data of drug in that particular population, then it might not be a great idea to consider patients who have a GFR of less than 60 ml in the present study also. It might be unethical. Now, in the given scenario, there is no data why a GFR cutoff of 60 was used. Was it something decided by the investigator to demonstrate that this drug is going to be efficacious in the population with a decent GFR, or was it because of some safety concerns? We don't know. So if there is some data to show that this drug can be used in people with an estimated GFR of less than 60, it is perfectly fine to include patients with EGFR less than 60. But in that case, probably we will have to limit to maybe say an EGFR of 30 ml or so. So you can very well select EGFR between 30 to 90 ml. The problem with the lesser EGFRs, the CKD stage 4 is, CKD stage 4 generally is not considered as a treatable situation. So basically it's a preparatory phase and the progression rates might be pretty different from the other stages. Now the second question, will you include patients with proteinuria? Of course, whatever data from the licensing trial shows that this drug shows some benefits in patients who are having protein excretion. So definitely we are going to include patients with proteinuria. And without proteinuria, probably for the time being, we might not include. And the next question is, what should be the upper and lower limit of proteinuria? So it might be okay to include patients with urine albumin excretion of 30 to 300 as well. But we need to carefully select those patients, because we know that those who have a moderately elevated urine albumin excretion, some of them revert back to normoalbuminuric states also. So if we are including that sort of patients, we have to ensure that they are having persistent albuminuria for a predefined period of time. So another option is you can include patients who are having proteinuria more than 300 milligram also, without including patients with moderately elevated albumin. The other question is whether we will prescribe an upper limit of proteinuria. Again, that is up to the investigator. So we know that people who have massive proteinuria, say to the tune of 8 gram, 10 gram and all, most of the time the prognosis is slightly different from the other patients. And if you want to have a cutoff of proteinuria, well and good, that's perfectly acceptable. So I would leave it up to the investigator to decide on the upper limit of cutoff. If somebody wants to put it as 3 gram, fine. If somebody wants to put it as 5 gram, fine. But the only thing we need to be careful at this point is it should be representative of the CKD population in a larger context. For example, if we put proteinuria as 1 gram, the type of patients who are going to benefit, we are actually cutting them to a very small group. So the limit of proteinuria should be sufficiently wide so as to reflect the scenario outside the trial. Now the other question is, what sort of CKD patients will you recruit? Incident CKD patients or prevalent CKD patients? So in studies where we are target is some nephroprotective strategies, it is always a good idea to recruit prevalent CKD patients, because incident CKD patients have too many unresolved issues. Sometimes the acidosis might not be controlled, the blood pressure might not be controlled, there might be a reversible thing which could be overlooked. So if we end up recruiting incident CKD patients, then probably the clinical behavior is not going to be decided by your intervention, but some other factors which are inherent to the CKD also. The other question was an age cutoff. Yes, we are going to do that in adults because the initial trial was done in adult. And if we try to mix adult and pediatric CKD population, that is going to be slightly problematic, because the etiology of CKD in the pediatric population is going to be different. The progression rates are also going to be different. and we might end up recruiting quite a lot of individuals with genetic diseases also. So it is always better, especially with this current drug in question, it's not a good idea to recruit pediatric patients. Now, if we put an age cutoff, somebody wanted to put an age cutoff of say 60 or 65. The problem in having an age cutoff is we know that the prevalence of CKD increases with increasing age. So if we put an age cutoff, we will be cutting off a vulnerable group who are going to be likely to benefit from this intervention. So in this given scenario, I might not go for an age cutoff. Then again, this were the exclusion criteria. This were the responses I got. So obviously, at this point, we have made a decision that we are going to do the study in those patients who are having a reasonably good GFR, eGFR of more than 60 ml, and proteinuria of more than 300 milligram per day. Then the age cutoff also we have discussed. Probably we will keep on a lower cutoff, but not an upper cutoff. Now the other questions is whether we will rule out patients with myocardial infarction, heart disease, and calcium channel blockers. So we know that 50% of the patients with chronic kidney disease will have some cardiac issue. So again, if we are excluding those patients, we are excluding a major chunk of CKD population who are likely to benefit from the disease. And again, another concern with calcium channel blocker is there are concerns that calcium channel blockers might increase the proteinuria. But I would say in the given scenario, it might not be a great concern. Even though it's a theoretical concern, there is not much of good data which shows that calcium channel blockers are associated with gradual deterioration of kidney function because of this proteinuria. So let us expect that probably randomization will take care of calcium channel blockers, and we all know that calcium channel blockers are used very well in chronic kidney disease, and we can believe at this point that probably randomization will take care and we will get a balanced group with respect to the use of calcium channel blockers. Now, coming to the trial design, we know very obviously that a crossover design is not possible. A crossover design is suited for drugs with very limited action. So here, what we are going to do is whether the drug is going to offer some renal protection. So obviously a crossover design is not going to be the choice. It's going to be a parallel arm design. And how many arms will be there? We will have one arm with the drug XYZ and another arm which is receiving standard of care treatment. And the other question is, I got a couple of responses telling that this could be designed as a superiority trial, and some other responses telling that this should be designed as a non-inferiority trial. Let us have a quick look back into what is a superiority design and what is an inferiority design. So let us say a drug, the efficacy rate of a particular drug is 70%. Now, if we are testing a new drug with the old drug in the comparator arm, if it is a superiority design, what we want to prove is the new drug, the efficacy is somewhere more than 70%. Not only the efficacy, the lower limit of confidence interval also should be more than 70%. Now, it could lie anywhere above 70%. The only concern is the lower limit of confidence interval should be above 70%, which is the efficacy of the current treatment in question. Now, in non-inferiority design, again, the same scenario, but we are testing a new drug with the standard therapy, and we want to prove that this drug is non-inferior to the existing drug. So sometimes, why do you want to prove that the drug is non-inferior? Sometimes the existing standard of care, it might be pretty toxic, or there might be difficulty in the administration. So it might be in an intravenous form. Suppose if you have an oral drug which is having comparable efficacy as to the standard of care, then obviously from a patient point of view, an oral drug is going to be much more acceptable. If your standard of care needs very stringent monitoring, and again for a patient, from a patient point, a patient would prefer a drug which might be slightly inferior, but which doesn't require that stringent monitoring conditions as that of the original drug in question. So in the non-inferiority trials, we select an acceptable margin which is somewhat lower than the efficacy of the current drug. And what we need to prove that the effect of the new drug lies within this margin. For example, in this example, the standard of care produces a cure in 70%, and we are selecting a non-inferiority margin of 10%. So the efficacy of the new drug can lie anywhere above 60%, that is 10% lesser than the 70%. And what we are concerned here is this limit of the confidence interval. The lowest confidence interval should be above the non-inferiority margin. So if we are getting the effect size and the confidence interval entirely above this side, then this drug is going to be superior. Now, this is a scenario in which the drug is inferior because the effect size is outside the non-inferiority margin, and the lowest confidence interval is also there. And here, if you see, the effect size is well within the non-inferiority margin, but if you see, the confidence intervals has exceeded the non-inferiority margin. In this scenario, we would consider the drug as non-inferior. So what we want to, we will consider the drug as inferior. So what we are trying to prove by a non-inferiority design is the product in question is no worse than the comparator by more than a pre-specified small amount. Now, one potential problem which can come with non-inferiority design is biocreep. Let us say a drug is able to produce a cure in around 90% of the individuals. But of course, the drug has certain negative aspects, like it has side effects, it might require stringent monitoring, the route of administration is not very congenial to the patient. So there is a setting to do a non-inferiority design with a drug which is better in any of these aspects. So now we are doing a non-inferiority trial with a new drug, and we are finding that the new drug is non-inferior to the standard of care. Now after some time, the new drug is going to be the standard of care. Now, if we want to test another drug, a third drug, which can be useful in the situation, it is very well possible that people might select the new non-inferiority margin from this drug 2 rather than drug 1. So, what will happen in long term? The original drug, which was effective in 90% of the population, might get replaced by a drug which is actually far less effective. So this is one important aspect of keeping on non-inferiority design and the non-inferior drug becoming the standard of care. Yes, so we will come to this whether we should plan it as a superiority design or a non-inferiority design later. So before that, we have to decide what should we do, what should we give as an intervention, and what should we give as the control. So one option is one arm should receive standard of care. So we know that in the current situation for proteinuric kidney disease, RAS inhibitors are the standard of care. So one arm will be receiving RAS inhibitors and the other arm will be receiving the new drug. That is one possible design. Then another possible design is one arm will be receiving the RAS inhibitors plus XYZ as an add-on therapy, and the other arm will continue to receive RAS inhibitors with a placebo. Now, which of these designs will you choose? I would like to have some response from the audience. So can someone type a few response? Which one will you, okay, second option. Placebo versus standard of care, add-on therapy.
A standard of care with add-on therapy, because
Okay.
you cannot deny standard of care to patients.
Yes, exactly. See, the problem is, this is a drug which has been there in the market based on a trial in myocardial infarction patients. We don't even know whether the drug is going to work in proteinuric CKD patients. So, if it works well and good, but it might be pretty unethical to deny patients the standard of care until and unless we have proven that this is going to work. So, in this current scenario, it might be unethical to rob patients of RAS blockade. So, basically, we have to design the trial as an add-on therapy. Now, can we compare this drug XYZ against RAS blockade? Yes, we can compare, not in the current situation, but suppose this drug is there in the market for a few years. So obviously, people will start using it for CKD patients as an off-label therapy. And over a couple of years, data will accumulate that this is going to work in patients with chronic kidney disease, and people will not observe any serious adverse effects in the population. And sometimes people might start using, as an off-label use, people might start using this in patients who are unable to tolerate ACE inhibitors. Now, if you have sufficient observational data which accumulates over a period, regarding the efficacy of this particular drug, yes, it reduces proteinuria and it reduces the glomerular filtration rate progression. That is a perfect scenario to compare this against RAS blockers. Or the alternate scenario is this drug has been specifically developed as a renoprotective drug in CKD, and here that is not the case. Now, this is the inclusion criteria which I am going to use. I would like to play safe here. So I'm going to recruit adults with an estimated GFR up to 60 ml. Like up to 60 ml means the lower limit of eGFR is going to be 60 ml. And an albumin creatinine ratio of more than 300 on stable treatment with the RAS blockers. So this is something which is very important. This pupil should be not on escalating or de-escalating treatment, because we know that once we change the RAS blockade, it might take a couple of months for the proteinuria to stabilize. So here you can define what is a stable treatment. I would leave it up to the principal investigator, say 3 months, 6 months or 1 year, whatever feasible in your clinical scenario you can choose, but you need to ensure that there won't be any escalation or de-escalation of therapy. And again, de-escalation of therapy is something which we cannot guarantee in the current scenario, because sometimes some of these patients might develop hyperkalemia as we recruit them into the trial. So we have to clearly define in what all scenarios we are going to de-escalate therapy for the intervention as well as the control arm. Now, exclusion criteria. I was talking about the recruitment of incident versus prevalent chronic kidney disease. So you can either state in the inclusion criteria that you are going to recruit prevalent chronic kidney disease, or you can put it in the exclusion criteria in such a way that you are not going to recruit any incident chronic kidney disease. So people with a recent history of acute kidney injury should be excluded. And again, if you see this exclusion criteria, I have written a little bit ambiguous way. And this is not the way an exclusion criteria should be written. And in a randomized controlled trial, you should not leave any scope for guesswork. So whatever you want to recruit or not recruit, you need to note it down very clearly. So you can define the acute kidney injury as say more than 0.3 milligram rise in creatinine, and the time period also you can specify in the preceding 3 months or 6 months. Again, that is up to you. And rapid decline in GFR, again, this needs to be defined. Say more than 10% decline in GFR in over a period of 3 months or 6 months. If you can find any standard accepted definitions, you can stick on to that. Again, uncontrolled hypertension, this is something which can alter the GFR trajectories. Again, this should be defined. It is up to you to put on the upper limit, say 160 by 100 or 180 by 100. You can define the number of antihypertensives, say 4 or 5 antihypertensives, which includes a diuretic. The problem in defining uncontrolled hypertension is if we stick on to the conventional standards, say 140 by 90, you might not get any patients, because we know that most of the patients will have some borderline hypertension, like in spite of optimal drug control. Then since we are recruiting patients with more than 60 ml GFR, there's a possibility that we might encounter quite a lot of nephrotic syndrome patients who have a different prognosis, who have a different management guidelines, and we have to exclude them. We have to exclude patients receiving immunosuppressants. You can put kidney transplant as an exclusion criteria, because apart from the proteinuria and the native kidney disease, there might be other factors operating in the kidney transplant patients. And people with a limited life expectancy. Again, this needs to be defined. It should not be left to guesswork to the recruiting personnel. Yes, now another problem which we have not considered is the use of SGLT2 blockade. This should not have been a problem till recently, but now this month the DAPA-CKD trials results are out, and it has shown that SGLT2 blockade gives additional benefit in over and above the RAS blockade. So now if we have to think of SGLT2 blockade at this point, So whether we should include or whether we should exclude, what should we do with patients on SGLT2 blockade? You know that the DAPA-CKD trials are just out, and it might take another couple of years for SGLT2 prescription to become widespread. People might be looking for more evidence. At least to me, I might not start tomorrow writing SGLT2 blockade based on DAPA-CKD trial. I might wait for a little bit of evidence. Whereas on the other hand, another person, another nephrologist probably would be perfectly happy. So it might take a couple of years for rampant use of SGLT2 blockade, but if you are proceeding with such a study now, you are going to encounter patients who are on SGLT2 blockade. Now the question is whether you have to set it as an exclusion criteria. If you want to set it as an exclusion criteria, you can set it as an exclusion criteria. But you should be aware of the fact that as time passes, the use of SGLT2 blockade might be increasing in non-diabetic CKD. So there are two options here. You can exclude patients who are on SGLT2 blockade, but if you are doing the same study after 3-4 years and SGLT2 blockade proves to be an efficient therapy, then it might be difficult to find patients who are not on SGLT2 blockade. In such scenario, you can include SGLT2 blockade, but this is going to be a potential confounder. For example, if your intervention arm has more SGLT2 blockade compared to the control arm, then the effect you are going to see might not be an effect of the drug you are testing, it might be an effect of SGLT2 blockade. So one way to avoid such problem is you can keep SGLT2 blockade as a stratification variable. And the time of the RCT, the most important thing which decides the time is the resources, and RCT is labor intensive. It needs quite a lot of effort from human effort, as well as it needs quite a lot of monetary resources. So ideal scenario, you have the best option for the current drug in question is you give it and see what proportion of those patients progresses to end-stage renal disease. But we are recruiting patients with a glomerular filtration rate of more than 60 ml. It might take many years, maybe 5 years, 6 years, or 7 years. The question is, do you really have that much of resources to support the trial for that much time? And if you keep a very long follow-up, naturally you are going to have quite a lot of lots of loss of follow-up. So in this scenario, you have other options. We can compare the glomerular filtration rate after a predefined period of time. You can compare the proteinuria between the two arms after a period of time. So again, this time, how much should be the time duration? You should give sufficient time for an outcome to develop. For example, you are assessing the outcome at 3 months. Probably you don't really see any realistic change in glomerular filtration rate at the end of 3 months. So you should give sufficient time for an outcome to develop and what is feasible with your resources. And again, this time factor, you can keep changing your primary objective based on this time factor. For example, if I am doing this study for a period of say 1 year or 18 months, I would be more interested in the change in GFR between the two arms. Whereas if I have the resources to do the study for 5 years, I am going to make another thing, probably the ESRD rates and transplant rates or death as the primary outcome. So again, these were the responses which I got for primary outcomes. Somebody wanted a composite endpoint of death and myocardial infarction. Somebody wanted multiple endpoints, doubling of creatinine, estimated GFR more than 10%, reduction, proteinuria reduction by 50%, and someone wanted a co-primary outcome. So as I said, outcome depends upon how much time, how much resources you are having. Suppose if you are going to have a long trial, you have sufficient support to run a long trial, at least lasting for 3 to 5 years, then probably you can keep a composite endpoint of death and myocardial infarction. But keeping death and myocardial infarction, you need to take into other competing risk factors. Some of them might get a preemptive kidney transplant. Some of them might become end-stage renal disease. So rather than limiting to death and myocardial infarction, you need to add other things like preemptive kidney transplantation, end-stage renal disease, and maybe sometimes a 50% reduction in GFR as the composite endpoint. Now the other question will come whether we can keep this doubling of creatinine, eGFR more than 10%, proteinuria reduction by 50% as a multiple endpoints. So If you keep these 3 endpoints, then the sample size is going to go quite high, and there might be issues with multiplicity comparisons. And most of the time, quite a lot of practical difficulties also might come. So rather than keeping this as multiple endpoints, as I told earlier, it is always better to keep this as a composite endpoint. Co-primary outcomes, 50% reduction in EGF and ESRD or ESRD. So when we select a co-primary outcome, you need not go for multiplicity comparisons, but you are going to call the trial as success only if both the co-primary outcomes has been met. And when you select a co-primary outcomes, it should be important but different. So probably there is no point in taking 2 GFR based criterion as a co-primary outcome. You can select a GFR based criteria as well as a proteinuria based criteria, but again, there should be a couple of potential issues which we will discuss in the next few slides. So at this time, I'm going to take a single outcome. I'm going to design a study which is lasting for only 18 months. So in that scenario, probably going for a composite outcome might not be the best, because most of the time I'm not going to, if I keep a composite endpoint as ESRD, death or a predefined reduction in GFR, most of the time I'm not going to attain that outcome in the 18 months time. Whereas if I was going for a slightly longer trial, I would have been pretty happy to take a composite endpoint as the outcome. So with the trial design I have in my mind, I'm going to give this drug XYZ as an add-on therapy to people who are already on optimal RAS blockade. So these are the outcomes which I can take. So I can analyze the outcome as a primary outcome. That is, I can look for the changes in glomerular filtration rate or proteinuria at the end of 18 months. And I can take a binary outcome. If it's a long trial, I can take it a progression to CKD stage 5 or advanced stages of CKD. Or I can actually take a progression to a predefined endpoint, say 20% reduction in GFR, 30% reduction in GFR, or remission or progression of proteinuria. The other thing is time-dependent outcomes. So here I'm not considering a time-dependent outcome because I'm doing the study for 18 months and I don't really think any major events like death or ESRD, it might happen, but the numbers might be very less and probably it might not be meaningful to consider this time-dependent outcome with a short duration study like this. So I'm taking this out. Now, what is left is a continuous outcome and a binary outcome. So we will look into how actually we will proceed. Now, again, I'm going back to the previous situation. Somebody wanted to take 2 primary outcomes, change in estimated GFR and change in proteinuria. So here you need to increase the sample size because of the multiplicity comparison. But the advantage is you can license the drug, you can use it, you can call the trial a success if either of the endpoint is met. Now this would be the potential results. So at the end of the study, I am noticing that the drug shows preservation of GFR and it reduces the proteinuria. Well and good, perfect, okay? So the other potential situation is it shows preservation of GFR, no reduction in proteinuria. I'm a little concerned, but still we know that what is more important is preservation of GFR. If at the end of 18 months, a drug does not reduce proteinuria, but it preserves GFR, still it is worthwhile proceeding with that drug. But now the other scenario, you are finding that the glomerular filtration is reducing and the proteinuria is, the drug is able to reduce the proteinuria, but it is not able to preserve GFR. As a nephrologist, will you be happy in prescribing such a drug? Definitely, I might not be happy because irrespective of proteinuria, what is more important? What decides whether you're going to go for end-stage renal disease is the reduction in GFR. So this is the problem. If we select multiple primary endpoints, you might end up getting this sort of results. So as per the definitions of multiple primary endpoints, if one of the endpoint is met, fine, you can call the trial a success. But in this third situation, I would be hesitant to call this trial as a success. Now, co-primary endpoints, there is no multiplicity comparison. So you need not make any adjustments for multiplicity. So again, if we take GFR, change in GFR and change in proteinuria as co-primary endpoints, we need to meet both the endpoints to call the trial as a success. But in this scenario, even if it does not reduce the proteinuria is remaining same. If the drug is able to preserve the GFR, I think probably that is sufficient enough to warrant the use of this drug in future. Now, we were discussing about this co-primary outcome, end-stage renal disease and 50% reduction in GFR. So, we should not take related endpoints as the co-primary outcome. So, because these two criteria, they are based on estimated GFR. So, if you want to add a co-primary outcome, it is going to be something slightly different from a GFR criteria. Let us say this is the result we get. So, the first co-primary endpoint, 50% reduction in eGFR, the p-value is significant. In the intervention arm, 20% only attained this, whereas in the control arm, it was double. Whereas the rates of ESRD are similar in two arms at the end of the trial. Now, again, if we had selected these two as co-primary endpoints, this trial is not going to be considered as a success. But to me, 50% reduction in GFR in the intervention arm is something great, even if the ESRD rates are similar. So this is the problem when you select two totally related things as a co-primary endpoints. If you select co-primary endpoints, it should be something different, yet critically important in the natural history of the disease. Now, I am not taking composite endpoints at this time, but if I select a composite endpoint, what are the parameters which I am going to select? I might select death, end-stage renal disease, transplant, and maybe if you want to have a predefined criteria on GFR reduction, say 50% GFR reduction, that is also going to be fine. But you should remember that if we include patients over a wide range of kidney disease, say you are including CKD1 to CKD4 or CKD3, and if you include a 50% reduction in GFR, most of your patients will attain that endpoint rather than death, ESRD and transplant. So sometimes more relevant endpoints like death, ESRD and transplant might get diluted if you include a GFR based criteria. And this is useful when you have a decent follow-up time so that the event rates are there. For example, if you see the DAPA-CKD trial, which recruited proteinuric patients who are on RAS blockade, the event rate was maybe around 9%, 10% after a median follow-up of 2.4 years. So you should be aware that the event rates might be smaller if you select a lower follow-up period. So these are the endpoints I would consider. So only one primary outcome. Since I'm planning for a short duration study, the eGFR between the two arms at the end of the study and the proportion of patients who progress, and I would say 10%, I've just taken it as an arbitrary cutoff just to demonstrate the data. I'm actually showing the analysis of the data. So just for that purpose only, I've taken 10%. You are free to have a little more reasonable things like say more than 20% or more than 30%. Secondary outcomes, whatever you cannot put as a primary outcome, you put it as a secondary outcome. Whatever is biologically plausible can be put as a secondary outcome. Just a minute. So this is the final study plan. So what I just wanted to convey is there is no golden rule for planning a randomized control trial. So it can be done. The most important thing is your resources, and you have to design a study which is biologically plausible within the available resources. And another thing is you need to be an expert in designing the study, and you need to be a subject expert. If you don't have the expertise in designing a study, never hesitate to get help from a design expert, because in the end of the study, if you generate a lot of data, you go to the statistician. If you design the study properly, improperly, then the statistician will not be able to help you other than to do a postmortem examination of your data and tell you what went wrong. So this is my study plan. I'm going to do it as a parallel arm study. I'm going to do it as an add-on therapy to the standard of care. Here the standard of care being optimal use of RAS blockade. I'm going to put it as a superiority design and the duration is 18 months. And again, I would like to tell that this duration can be 12 months. But I would say if your idea is preservation of GFR, it's better to keep it sufficiently long rather than 3 months or 6 months. Now coming to the sample size calculation, Dr. Harichandra Kumar will be discussing about sample size calculation after my talk. He will be showing you how to calculate sample size with different types of design, superiority, non-inferiority, and equivalence design. So these are the factors which go into the sample size calculation. Type 1 error is going to be much more major error compared to type 2. So the allowance of type 1 error is a little bit strict. So type 1 error traditionally is kept at 0.05. You can keep it at 0.01 also, but that is going to increase your sample sizes. Similarly, type 2 error, the minimum recommended type 2 error is 0.2. That corresponds to a power of 80%. You can keep it 0.1 also, but again, here your sample size is going to increase. Now, so these are sort of fixed things. You don't really have options. And the other one is difference, how much difference you are expecting. So here, if I take the GFR as a continuous variable, I'm going to analyze the glomerular filtration rate between the intervention and control arm as a continuous variable. So I have to find out how much difference should be there between the two arms. How much is acceptable? See, whether it is acceptable to have a 1 ml difference between the intervention and control, it doesn't really make much of a difference. So you have to go for some realistic difference between the intervention and control arm, and you should have some idea regarding how much to expect. For example, if you keep a difference of say 20 ml or 30 ml, we know that it is humanly impossible to have a drug which produces 20 ml or 30 ml difference. You might end up getting very small sample sizes, but ultimately you will not be able to prove that effect. On the other hand, too small a difference might not be clinically relevant. So basically one more extra drug and at the end of 18 months, you're finding that your GFR is less by 1 ml or your GFR is better by 1 ml. It doesn't really make any clinical meaning to the patient. So you should have a realistic difference which is clinically relevant. And again, the sample sizes will keep on changing with the study design. So that Dr. Harichandra Kumar will be discussing. And another thing is if there are more than one arm, you need to consider that in the sample size calculation. When we increase the arm number from 2 to 3, some increase in the sample size happens. So this was discussed in the last class. So from where we will get the pilot target difference. In this study, we can look at that previous data. How much, if something is published, you can base your calculations based on that. So otherwise, you can contact the principal investigator and ask. Most of the time, people will be ready to help. And in well-established scenarios, you can depend on the systematic reviews and meta-analysis for helping you in calculating the effect sizes. Then sometimes a few previous studies would have reported. Then sometimes you don't really have any data. You might be just pursuing a hunch, especially when you are doing some pragmatic trials. So in that scenarios, the best way is ask experts. Ask the experts in your specialty. What would be the approximate sample size? And a judgment call sometimes in certain scenarios you will be forced to take, but the problem is, as you know, the judgment can go wrong at any point. Now, there are different ways of, sorry. Expressing the target difference. One is an absolute difference. Say the GFR is different by so and so, or a relative difference in glomerular filtration rate. Or it could be binary, the number of patients, the proportion of patients who reach a predefined endpoint. Here I have taken the predefined endpoint as 10% reduction in GFR. And again, survival times, which we are not considering with the current study design because of the shorter follow-up times. Now coming to the absolute change versus relative change. It is always, if possible, it is always better if you stick on to the absolute change. For example, in glomerular filtration rate, blood pressure, cholesterol, pain scores, you can tell that the intervention arm, this is going to be the value in intervention arm, this is going to be the value in the control arm, and this is the difference. But in some scenarios, you might be measuring the relative change. Here, again, the variable is measured as a continuous variable, but it is expressed as a percentage change from the baseline value. I hope this will be clear with the next example. Say, you can express the results in two different ways in this study, expected results. The glomerular filtration in the intervention arm is higher by 5 ml with a standard deviation of 5 for those who received the drug XYZ. Or you can tell the glomerular filtration was higher by 10% with a standard deviation of 5 for those who received the intervention. So which would you prefer? Definitely the first one, because that is what we are familiar. But there might be another clinical scenario where you are giving an intervention and seeing the peak expiratory flow rates. The PEFR increased by 20% from baseline in the intervention arm, whereas no change was noticed in control. And you can tell that the PEFR was higher by 50 ml in the intervention arm, whereas no change was noticed in the control. So in this scenario, for example, something like a peak expiratory flow rate, it always depends upon the baseline value. And such scenarios, putting a relative change might be acceptable, or it is not mandatory that you should put an absolute change here. Other similar scenario is pain scores. Sometimes reduction in pain scores with the medication. So if possible, most of the scenarios in nephrology, it is always better to put the absolute change rather than relative change. But you should be aware that there might be some scenarios which mandates putting the relative change rather than the absolute change. So it is left to the clinical scenario and the biological behavior of the disease in question. Now the questions, everybody has given correct responses regarding the randomization. We will do a block randomization. So equal versus unequal blocks, if you are planning to use a placebo, it doesn't really matter. But if it's an open label trial, if you use an equal block, say if you use an equal block of 3, you know the first patient is allotted to one arm, second patient allotted to another arm, and the third patient also allotted to another arm. If you know the allocation in the 3 patients, now you can predict who is going to be the fourth, which arm the fourth patient is going to. So this allows probably some scope of manipulation from the person who recruits. So if it's an open label trial, it's always better to go for unequal blocks rather than equal sized blocks. Now, stratification needed, this was the responses: level of proteinuria, age, CKD stage, native kidney disease, glomerular filtration ranges, comorbidities. So one thing we need to keep in mind is we need not stratify for every variable which is going to be included into the study. Stratify only the key prognostic variable, and you should keep in mind that the more the strata, the greater will be the imbalance. So certain variables like level of proteinuria, age, native kidney disease, CKD stage, GFR range, comorbidities, probably we can assume that randomization will take care of most of the variable. So if I am designing the study, the only possible strata which I would like to put is diabetes versus non-diabetic kidney disease, because we know that the GFR progression is somewhat steeper in diabetic kidney disease compared to other glomerular diseases. And if I'm planning to include patients with SGLT2 blockade, I would include that as a strata at this point, and I might not include another strata. And again, stratification might not be needed if you are recruiting a very trial with large numbers. There is a tendency that most of the key variables will be even with larger numbers. This is important when you are conducting a trial with a little bit small numbers. Now, again, once you decide on the sample size and once you have decided on the randomization, then you should ensure that the allocation is concealed and blinding. It is always better to have a blinded study, because if it's an open label trial, some sort of biases are going to creep in. Now, coming to something which we have not covered in the last class is interim analysis. So interim analysis should be always planned, never go for unplanned interim analysis. And it would help to reduce the cost, it would help to cut short the resources. And because in the middle, if we are analyzing and we are finding that the drug is not working, then probably there's no point in continuing with the drug. You can stop the study at that point. And most of the time, interim analysis would result in an early termination of the study because of safety concerns, lack of benefits, or a slow patient accrual rates. And the other scenario is there might be early declaration of success. You are finding a sufficiently good enough difference between the intervention arm and control arm. And in some situations, in spite of interim analysis, the study would continue with the same plan, or some scenarios, it might lead to modification of the sample size or modification of the design. Now, one potential problem with interim analysis is, so we know that whenever we handle the data, there will be an alpha error. And the alpha error is previously set as 0.05 or 0.01, whatever we had selected. So when we do an interim analysis at this point, at an alpha error of, if we preset the alpha error as 0.5, here we are spending the entire 0.05 alpha here. If we are doing another analysis, the alpha error keeps on accumulating. So we have to have some consensus on how to spend the alpha error. If we are planning an interim analysis, it should be previously stated how we are going to handle this alpha error. We cannot accumulate this alpha error to keep on accumulating, because at the time of third analysis, your alpha error is no longer 0.05, it might be somewhere around 0.13 or so. So one way of doing the interim analysis is, the overall alpha will be set at 0.05 and you give a very small alpha to the first look, say 0.01 or so. And you are going to declare the study as a success if you are going to get a p-value less than 0.01, not 0.05. The other option is to divide this alpha error equally. If we are going to have 5 analyses, 4 interim analysis and 1 final analysis, divide the alpha error equally. So 0.05 divided by 5, each analysis will get an alpha error of 0.01 and you're going to declare the trial as a success if you're going to get a values less than 0.01. Now the third approach is you get a very minuscule amount. In the first approach we were giving say 0.01 or 0.005 as the alpha. Here you're going to give very minimal alpha in the initial analysis, and the final analysis would be performed at a total alpha of 5%. So one criticism is the initial alpha which you are giving is very small, say it might be 0.0001 like that, and most of the time you might never attain that p-values in the initial interim analysis, so the study will continue as planned. Now there are problems with the potential declaration of early success. So early failure, again the harm is going to be less. The drug might be beneficial had the study been continued, but ultimately you are not going to harm people, you are just denying the drug. But if a harmful drug, if a potentially harmful drug is declared to be successful in the early, in the interim analysis, the number of patients who are going to get exposed to that drug, the potential harm is going to be much more. So interim analysis, again the numbers will be low and the follow-up times will be shorter. And sometimes you can miss the long-term adverse effect. For example, the initial stent trials. After putting a stent, 6 months the patients will be very well, they will not have any angina and most of them will be doing well and they will be going back to their normal lives. The problem is, if the stent trials are terminated at say 6 months or 1 year, nobody will know about the long-term adverse effect, that is the in-stent restenosis. Then sometimes we know, like if you recall the first class confounders, bias and all, if you remember the picture Dr. Datta has shown, you see that as sample size increases, the random error becomes less. So if we are terminating the study at an early date, there is a very likely possibility that we might be overestimating the efficacy. The play of chance becomes more important. So I will show you an example. This is a study which has looked into the utility of bisoprolol to prevent mortality after cardiac surgery. If you look at the survival curves, you see the effect is striking. Bisoprolol reduces the mortality. Now, what is this study was terminated after an interim analysis. Now, what is the problem? If you see, the follow-up is just 28 days after surgery. The mortality in the bisoprolol arm was only 3, whereas 18 patients died in the standard care. So, this study was stopped at 28 days after. The study was stopped when 50% of the patients were recruited. The problem is this looks too good to be true. Had they gone ahead and this difference of say 3 versus 18 in the control arm and the intervention arm, that looks actually sort of unbelievable. If this was true, then probably we could not have expected any mortality or very minimal mortality with cardiac surgery after 20 years of publishing this trial. So this is the problem. Sometimes you will just get a part of the picture, not entire picture, especially common with study with very small sample sizes like this. Now, once you have decided on the other things, you should decide the frequency of data collection, how you are going to measure. Here we will be measuring creatinine and proteinuria. So this is a 18-month study. So obviously there should be a baseline sample, there should be an exit sample. And again, it is up to the investigator to decide whether you should have intermittent samples measured. And any adverse effect noticed during the trial also should be reported. Then we will go to the data analysis. For the purpose of data analysis, I have created a database with just 30 patients, 15 in the intervention arm and 15 in the control arm. And this is a completely cooked up database just for the purpose of this talk. So don't expect the similar biological behavior as you see in day-to-day practice. So now this is a superiority trial and it should be treated by intention to treat analysis. So which means that all participants who are randomized are included in the statistical analysis and they are analyzed according to the group they were originally assigned, regardless of whether they got the treatment, whether they withdrew or whether they completed the treatment. And ITT preserves the prognostic balance and sample size, and it is going to give you a conservative, unbiased treatment effect. And if it is a non-inferiority trial, you should do both ITT and per protocol analysis, and both should show the same results. Okay. I hope you are all familiar with SPSS because last week Harichandra Kumar had shown you how to go about with SPSS. So here, this is actually the patient ID is a little jumbled. I have just selected only a couple of parameters: age, gender, intervention, body mass index, 24-hour urine protein at the time of enrollment, serum albumin levels, baseline GFR, eGFR, final GFR, and the change, absolute change in GFR. And one binary endpoint which I considered was 10% reduction in GFR. So again, I have reclassified the patients like 10% reduction, less than 10% reduction in GFR, and more than 10% reduction in GFR. So the first thing I have done is, for all continuous variable, I have checked whether the data is normally distributed. This is important. If my data is not normally distributed, my analysis plan is going to be slightly different. So I have done a Kolmogorov-Smirnov test. Here you have to look at the asymptotic significance. The p-values are all more than 0.05, which means that the data is normally distributed. Now, I'm comparing the baseline characteristics. So as per the consort statements, you are not supposed to compare the baseline characteristics, but this is just for the sake of demonstration. I'm showing you how to compare the baseline characteristics. So here, SPSS, you have to click on the Analyze window. A drop-down menu appears. You have to select the compare means, and here you have to select the independent sample t-test. A window like this will come. So I'm here comparing the baseline variables. So whatever variables at the baseline, you put it into the test variable box. The grouping variable is going to be your group, that is intervention versus control. I have labeled group as 0 and 1. So you have to define the groups as 0 and 1. Then you need to click the OK. So This is going to be the SPSS output. The initial part gives you the means and the second part gives you the significance. Now, here everything looks okay except that the protein at entry in the intervention arm is slightly higher when compared to that of the control. So let us see whether there is any difference. So here you have to see the Levine's test for equality of variances. So if the value is more than 0.05, you have to look at the significance level and you will take this one equal variances assumed. Now, age is comparable, the p-value is 0.77, BMI is comparable, albumin at entry is comparable, GFR at entry is comparable, but the protein at entry is different. Okay. Now, this is going to be a sort of problem. You know that the final GFR is going to be decided by the GFR at admission as well as the proteinuria. So this is how it would look like. The control arm has lesser proteinuria, whereas the intervention arm had more proteinuria. Now, there are two ways of comparing the continuous data. One is you ignore the baseline data and compare the GFR at the exit. Second thing is you can compare the GFR between the groups. So don't expect that this two will behave in the same way. So let us see. Here I am comparing the glomerular filtration rate between the two groups at exit. Again, same thing, I am doing an independent sample t-test. The same thing, compare means independent sample t-test. I am putting GFR at exit in the test variable box. Grouping variable is the group. And this is how it comes. In the control arm, the glomerular filtration rate at the end was 60 and the intervention arm, it was 66. The variances are equal. And the significance is 0.057. So, in spite of having a numerical difference, there is no significance. So, according to independent t-test, there is no difference between the glomerular filtration rate between the two arms. Now, let us see what happens when we repeat the test with the change score. Again, the same thing I am doing, an independent sample t-test with the change in glomerular filtration rate from the baseline. And in the control arm, the GFR reduced by -9. Intervention arm, GFR reduced by -5. The variances are distributed equal and the p-values are 0.014. So now this is the situation. Final eGFR, the p-value is not different and the change in eGFR, the p-value is significant. Which one will you take? Can I have some inputs at this point? So can I get a few responses? Which one will you take?
I think the change in eGFR is more significant. This is because the initial GFR will actually alter the results.
Okay, change in GFR. Okay, it's not just that, okay, everybody is actually going in for change in GFR. Okay, it is not just because you got a significant p-value, that's not the reason. So there are a few potential problems which happens when we analyze. Oh my God, my slide is not moving. Okay, we have a few potential problems when we compare continuous data. Okay, one is the baseline imbalances. Sometimes it is possible that in spite of our randomization attempts, the glomerular filtration rate in both groups might not be comparable. If the intervention arm had a slightly low GFR, then obviously looking at the absolute GFR at the end is not going to give you a meaningful picture. Then sometimes key prognostic variables, as I showed you, proteinuria is different between the two arms. Sometimes it is possible that the body mass index would be different. Sometimes it is possible that the blood pressures might be different. And we know that all these things are going to affect the final outcome. So this is one problem which can come up with the continuous data. And another thing is the baseline score can correlate very well with the final score. So normally in almost all final scores will show some amount of correlation. But when the correlation is going to be perfect, when the correlation coefficient is going to be more than 0.8 or so, then if you compare the absolute values, you're going to get a result like this. Actually, in this data which I showed, the correlation coefficient between the beginning GFR, entry GFR, and the exit GFR was 0.9. So, and when this baseline score, even if the baseline imbalances are not there, if the baseline score correlates well with the final score, it is always better to use the change score. Now, again, that will not settle our issue because there was a baseline imbalance. The proteinuria was high. Using the change score will not solve this issue of having a different level of proteinuria. We will come to that in the next couple of slides. And another important problem with continuous data is regression to the mean. Not all continuous data exhibit this, but there are certain continuous types of data which will very well exhibit the regression to the mean. Now, this is just the weight of a particular person who is having a steady lifestyle documented over a period of say 2 years. There are 12 readings taken 2 months apart. Now, if you see that the weight, now certain parameters, weight and anthropometric parameters, there might be other parameters also which show a similar behavior. They don't remain same over a period of time. And now, if we are taking a sampling, weight, if you are taking weight at this particular point, which is actually an extreme, the next future point tends to be closer towards the mean. And this can occur in all sorts of data, whether we observe, whether it's binary data or whether it is non-normal data. This can occur in almost all types of data, and this might persist in spite of randomization. So you might be thinking that if there is one person exhibiting regression to mean in the intervention arm, that would be counterbalanced by another person in the control arm. But sometimes it can affect the population as well. So rather than, this is not something which is limited to the individual level, it can happen at a population level also. Let us say this is my population from which I have taken the sample. This 30 patients were selected from a sampling population of say 3000, and this is the main glomerular filtration rate in my population, and this is going to be the population mean. If I want to select 15 patients in the control arm, ideally this 15 patients should represent 15 different data points located on either side of this mean. But that need not happen always. Sometimes you might end up taking sample from one end of the tail. So if we end up recruiting your intervention patients from this particular arm, this is going to be the mean for the patients. This is the sample mean 1. Now, next time, even if I don't do any intervention, according to the regression of mean, according to the picture which I have shown, this mean has a tendency to move towards the population mean. So, if I repeat the mean, if I repeat the same GFR in this population after some time without any intervention, I am going to get a value slightly closer to the mean. Now, if this is the intervention arm, this gives the impression that even if the intervention is not working, your mean is increasing and it is going towards the population mean, and it will give you a false impression that your intervention is changing the mean. Now, the extreme worst case scenario, I selected my controls somehow, they got selected from this arm, and again when I repeat the second sample, second value, this is going closer towards the mean. This will give you an impression that the control values are reducing. So this can happen at a population level. So regression to mean will not be taken care of if you take the change scores. So in such scenarios, you will have to use some other method called ANCOVA. It takes care of all the imbalances at the baseline as well as the regression to the mean. And it shows that if we use ANCOVA, even if we preset the power at 80%, the final power which we are going to get after ANCOVA might be much more than 80%. And there is another way when you have multiple repeated measurements. This is actually 2 measurements, one at entry and the second one at baseline. Suppose you have 5 measurements and you want to assess this 5 measurements over a period of time, you have to use a repeated measures ANOVA. I will not be going into detail regarding the repeated measures of ANOVA because this data doesn't really need repeated measures of ANOVA, and RM ANOVA has some additional assumptions also which sometimes might be difficult to sustain with the data like glomerular filtration rate. So I'm not really going into how to use a RM ANOVA and all, and I will show you how to use an ANCOVA. So ANCOVA, I hope you might be remembering the last class. So Dr. Harichandra Kumar was telling about the assumptions of ANOVA. So dependent variable, here the dependent variable is glomerular filtration rate. That should be continuous variable and it should be normally distributed, and the observations should be independent of each other, and the variances between the groups should be equal. So this variances you can test by looking at the Levin's test. The Levin's test more than 0.05 means that the variances are equal. And in addition to these assumptions, there are other few assumptions in ANCOVA. So one is linearity. The dependent variable and the covariate should show a linear relationship. For example, the dependent variable in ANCOVA is going to be the final EGFR. And the covariate, I am planning to include two covariates in this model. One is the baseline GFR and the other one is the proteinuria. So the baseline GFR and the final GFR should show a linear relationship. Also, the proteinuria and the final GFR should show a linear relationship. And there is something else called the homogeneity of regression of slope. If we create a regression line for this, if we plot this dependent variable and the covariate on x-axis and y-axis, you're going to get a scatter plot. Now, if we make a regression line for these two groups, intervention group and control group, they should be parallel to each other. There are a few other assumptions also, but I don't really want to confuse you at this point, so I'm not really going into that. And let us see how we will do an ANCOVA. So again, we have to go to the analyze command, and below compare means you will see something called a general linear model. Here you have to select the univariate command, and this would take you to a window. Here the dependent variable is eGFR at exit, and the fixed factor is the factor by which actually the groups are different. That is our intervention, which I have labeled as the group. We will not do anything for the random factors for the time being, and put the covariates which are affecting the outcome, that is the glomerular filtration rate at entry and the protein at entry in the covariate box. Then you have to click estimate marginal means. It will take you to another window where you will see two options, overall and group. You have to select the group and you have to click OK. So this will be the output. So you're going to, there is this GFR at baseline, protein at 24 hours, and your group, that is intervention versus control, is incorporated into a model, and plus there will be one error factor also. And the p-values for this group is 0.009, sorry, 0.029, which means that the intervention and the control, the values, the eGFR values are significantly different. And this is going to be down. If you click the group, you will get the estimated marginal means. And this estimated marginal means are the adjusted means for the covariates. Now, this is how the results would look. I am actually compiled the results from the three methods. Okay, there should be standard deviation or confidence interval. You should never put like this, the absolute value alone. It just gives you, say, answered by this particular model you have created. So the bigger the partial eta square, the better is going to be the effect size. Now another question is how to express the results, confidence interval versus p-values. So this is, I'm just showing the final results from a study, not from this study definitely. So you are getting three potential results. So if you're getting these results towards the intervention arm, this means that the intervention arm is better. The relative risk is less than 1 in intervention arm. Now you might end up thinking that the one farther away from a relative risk of 1 is going to be the best result. But if you put the confidence interval, even though this is further away from 1, the confidence interval is pretty broad. And this one is pretty close to 1, but the confidence interval is narrow. And confidence interval, this was what Dr. Nair sir was telling last time. The confidence interval means what might happen if the treatment were to be given in the entire population of interest. Now, with a very wide confidence interval, you are not really sure whether the effect reproduced in your study might be applicable to a larger population. So, the narrower the confidence interval, the better it is applicable when you extrapolate the results to the general population. Now, we are coming to some basic introduction about the repeated measures of ANOVA. I am just only telling about the context of using a repeated measures of ANOVA. So, most of the time, you are really interested in the final variable, final data collected, but sometimes it might be important to analyze the changes over time also. So this is used when observations are time dependent, because sometimes time acts as an important variable apart from your intervention. There are two potential situations. The first situation, probably you can relate the way you learned driving. The day one you started driving the car, you might be thinking that the car is behaving as if it has a brain of itself. But a couple of hours, you know how to learn, and gradually your driving skills improve. The second thing is a scenario also you can relate. Your consultant gives you homework every day. First day you will read, you'll be very prepared, but the consultant doesn't ask you any questions. Or if the consultant asks you questions and you answer, there's no response from the consultant. If you don't answer again, there's no response from the consultant. So same thing happen when you give an intervention. People really would get bored and they would stop following. Another scenario, there might be an effect, but the effect might be apparent only after a period of time. In such scenarios, it might be better to use a repeated measurements of ANOVA rather than taking the final score. I will show you a few examples. This is the effect of exercise program versus no exercise in health quality of life, health related quality of life in patients with moderate to severe CKD. So as expected, this pupil might be living a sedentary life and it is very difficult to coax them to do some exercise. But once you start doing the exercise, you can see that there is a gradual improvement which is apparent over a period of time. Here, if you are comparing these two values, fine, you are going to get the result. You are not going to miss the greater picture. But the problem is, if you are stopping the study at this point, the effect size probably is going to be somewhat smaller. And there is a possibility that you might end up concluding that, yeah, this is not going to work. The other scenario is depression. You are treating depression with the drugs plus cognitive therapy, and you know that depression does not change overnight. It might change after a couple of months. And here again, if you take this data, you're going to find a difference. But if somebody terminates the study at this point, you're not going to find any difference. The other extreme scenario is a active monitoring versus an educational intervention to see the compliance with the salt restriction. So the moment you start the intervention, the compliance goes up and it gradually decreases over a period of time. So here, if you take the data at this point, you might end up not noticing a difference. But in the other two scenarios which I described, the final data probably might be important. But here actually taking the final data, you might end up concluding that this is not going to work. But this is simple human behavior which actually has shown a change over a period of time. So in scenarios where you feel that the time is going to be an important factor, rather than taking the end score at the exit, you have to change this, you have to take the scores over a period of time. RM ANOVA is a little bit complicated, so I'm not going to demonstrate it for the time being. Now we come to the final part. So the other my primary outcome was EGFR change, but I told you earlier, I can put it in a different way as a binary variable also, because this has some implications on sample size calculations, which you will know when Dr. Hari is discussing in the next session. So here, if I take it as a binary data, what I need to do is I need to use a chi-square test. So here I have to go to the descriptive statistics and crosstabs. I have to select the crosstabs. So this is the result of cross tabulation, and you have to get the chi-square. And there is a small column here, 0 cells have expected counts less than 5%. If any of the cells have expected counts less than 5%, instead of the Pearson chi-square, you have to use the Fisher's exact t-test. And this is going to be the odds ratio. The odds ratio of the intervention, odds ratio, either direction you are going to take, it's going to be the same. For odds ratio is going to be 0.09, whereas the risk ratio is going to be 0.318. Generally, in RCTs, the odds ratio tends to be better when compared to the risk ratios. The only thing is when you're doing a meta-analysis, you should not confuse between the odds ratio and risk ratio. If you confuse odds, risk ratio for odds ratio, you might end up coming to a wrong conclusion. And this is the effect size. This again I have discussed last time. This is just a numerical, just a verbal interpretation of what I have seen in the chi-square. EGFR preservation was seen in 75% of the intervention arm compared to 21% in the control arm. And the absolute risk difference is 0.75 minus 0.21. That's going to be 0.54. And 1 divided by absolute risk difference gives you the number needed to treat. Here it is 1.8. We round it up to the nearest whole number. So this means that if you treat 2%, 1% is going to be benefited. So when you express binary data, rather than simply stopping at the odds ratios or risk ratios, you need to show the numbers needed to treat. So with that, I'm finishing my I'm unable to, shall I take the questions, or I'm not able to see the chats?
I think Aniket, if you could take up.
No, I'm able to see. I think I can spend some.
We continue with sir's session first and then take the.
Yeah, that would be fine. That also would be fine. I think actually probably most of the questions I have answered. Yes, yeah. Sir. Okay. Maybe Aniket, you can find out. Yeah, Aniket, meanwhile, you can find out whether there's anything unanswered. Probably me and Hari would, if it's a core statistics question, probably Harijendra Kumar will answer, and something related to the design, I will answer.
Yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am. So one question was, ma'am, how do we manage the difference in proteinuria in both arms at the beginning?
Oh, that is actually a little bit difficult. We have to assume that randomization will take care of that, but most often it's difficult. Yeah, that's something which actually I forgot to mention. Of all the different methods to analyze continuous data, ANCOVA is always recommended, as it is going to be much more powerful compared to the absolute values versus change scores. And now you will be asking a question. I again told that you should not compare the baseline covariates. So how will you know whether the baseline covariates are different? So what this consort statement, the recommendation given by consort statement is, you don't look for the differences in the baseline variables, but you predefine those clinically important variables before the data collection, at the implementation, at the planning stage of the trial, and you create an ANCOVA with those key prognostic predictors. And there is no way to ensure that all these are, randomization will take care most of the time, but in spite of randomization, sometimes you might end up seeing differences.
Next question is, should primary outcomes only be clinical?
It is always better that it is clinical, because sometimes you can use a surrogate marker. So I think actually we had discussed it during the previous RCT. So for example, from a patient point of view, death is important, dialysis is important. But when we are planning a trial, we know that not every patient included in the trial, or the majority of the patient, might not reach that outcome. So in that case, glomerular filtration rate we are using, that's not a clinical endpoint, it's a surrogate marker. It's a well-defined, well-validated surrogate marker. So in scenarios where it is difficult to have a clinical endpoint, you can use for a well-accepted surrogate marker.
Next question is, ma'am, what is the role of regulatory authorities while deciding the outcomes?
Regulatory authorities. So this is this trial which actually I was telling is a pragmatic trial. So from a licensing viewpoint, it is much more stringent. Doing a pragmatic trial and doing a trial for licensing is going to be much more stringent. Regulatory authorities, it might differ. For example, FDA has a different set of guidelines, so it might differ from country to country. So if you're planning to have a trial in India, what is mandated is, if you're planning to do a trial with a new drug, you should have a DCGI registration followed by a CTRI registration. If it is a drug which is already there and you are using it for a new indication, you can skip the drug controller registration because it is sort of licensed, but you need to go ahead with the clinical trial registry, CTRI registrations maintained by ICMR.
Now, next
So I
question
hope,
is, in the
yeah.
example which, ma'am,
Yes, please tell.
ma'am, you are saying something?
No. Please proceed.
In the third, so ma'am, the next question is, in the example which you were mentioning, the reduction in GFR may also cause a reduction in proteinuria. How do we account for that?
That is actually like, it might be with this current design, what we are trying to do, what we are trying to prove is your primary outcome is the reduction in GFR. So this study is sufficiently powered to answer your question which you have stated as the primary outcome, and you cannot come to any conclusions regarding the secondary outcome.
Next question is, isn't 18 months too long? Because so many other factors can worsen and potentially affect the outcomes in that period.
No, RCT, you are doing it in a controlled setting. So that is why you are not just administering the intervention to the patient and asking them to come back after 18 months. So an RCT, you should have frequent follow-ups. Even if you are not measuring the data in between, you should have frequent follow-ups and you should ensure that things are in a controllable way. So it is possible to have longer designs also. So 18 months, it's not going to be like what factors you're going to worsen. One is blood pressure. You have to ensure that the blood pressure has been controlled. So that is why you need to frequently monitor. And if there is anything which goes out of the way, you need to monitor that also. I would say 18 months is little small rather than a long period if the outcome is glomerular filtration rate.
Next question is on sample size. So I think
yeah, that I have already answered. Yeah, most of the questions I have answered. Effect size in SPSS, the recent version of SPSS, probably I don't know, about 26. 27 is having effect size. You have to simply click the effect size. If your version does not have effect size, you need to calculate it.
Next, so that is it, I think, with the questions.
Yeah.
So, ma'am,
ANCOVA is the similarity between ANCOVA and Cox proportional hazard is both uses regression, and it is not exactly similar.
Okay.
I think that finished all the questions.
Yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am. I think sir can continue.